Just how much of a groundbreaker was former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor? Evan Thomas will be here to talk about his new biography. First, how do you tell a story about race and class through the lives of the men in your own family? Mitchell Jackson will be here to talk about his latest book, Survival Math. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Joining us now, Evan Thomas. He is the author, most recently, of First, Sandra Day O'Connor, an intimate portrait of the first woman Supreme Court Justice. Evan, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
You've written many books, many biographies, both group and individual. How do you decide who it is that you want to write about?
The great thing about being a journalist and not an academic is I really don't have a specialty, so in theory, I can write about anything. In fact, I've written a lot about sort of post-World War II America. That interests me. My dad was in World War II, and that whole age of the rise of American power after World War II fascinates me. First book I ever did with Walter Isaacson was The Wise Men, about the group of men, they were in those days all men, who sort of created the Western Alliance and created the post-war order. And after that, I did books about Bobby Kennedy and Nixon and Eisenhower, sort of standard issue leaders. Occasionally, I would sail out of the pack and do something different. I like war because war has a lot of conflict, and writers love conflict. And so I did John Paul Jones. My publisher said to me, "Don't you want to wait for your retirement to do that one?" But it actually sold because it was a brief period of interest in the Revolutionary War. I did a book about the Spanish-American War because I was interested in Teddy Roosevelt being a war lover, being entranced with war. I did a book about a lawyer, Edward Bennett Williams. So I've been a little bit all over the place, but mostly in this general world of America on the rise after World War II.
This is a departure with Sandra Day O'Connor.
Well, it's about a woman. That's a big departure right there. And my wife was deeply involved in this book in a way. She's always been involved in my books, but really involved in this for the obvious reason that she's a woman. She went to Stanford. She grew up in the West, and she understood Justice O'Connor probably better than I did.
Is she a journalist as well?
She's a lawyer. That also was a big I did go. We met in law school, but she practiced law. I never practiced law. She did. All I remembered from law school was my con law class, although that was pretty important because that's what the Supreme Court does. How
did you decide to write about Sandra Day O'Connor?
They came to me.
Her family?
This is a little bit of a tangled tale. Kate Medina at Random House, famous editor, published The Lazy Bee. The Lazy Bee was Sandra O'Connor's memoir of growing up on a ranch in Arizona. Sold pretty well, actually, about 20 years ago. And Kate Medina was after Justice O'Connor to write her memoirs for years. And they did a couple of speech books, but no memoir. And Justice O'Connor wanted a legacy. She wanted something, but she just never got around to producing the memoir. So finally it was decided, well, a biography. And I was the Random House author with a law degree, basically. So they came to me, and I jumped at it because she's such a fascinating woman.
Did you have any trepidation, thinking, am I the right person for this? I'm not necessarily a Supreme Court person. She's a woman.
Yes, for all those reasons. She's a woman. I'd never written about a woman before. Supreme Court is really boring. Judicial biographies are boring. They are a boring march of cases. I've never read a really interesting one. There have been some well-done ones, but not really interesting. It's highly technical, the laws. I left the law
for a reason.
For a reason. So I had a lot of trepidation about all that. And the challenge was to bring her to life and to make the law part interesting. And that was a real challenge.
And this is also it's a full biography. Some of your other individual biographies have sort of been looking at a particular period or some aspect of the person.
Exactly. I mean, when I did Nixon, there have been 13 Nixon biographies. I wanted to take a fresh look at Nixon. So I had an angle. Eisenhower, I really just did his foreign policy. Bobby Kennedy was soup to nuts. But Arthur Schlesinger had come before me, so how,
Right.
This really was, there had been an earlier good biography by Joan Biskupic, but nothing like this because I had complete access. The Supreme Court is a secret place. Yes, it justifies itself by the opinions they write. It's public in that sense, but it is deeply secret, and you really can't do it unless you're inside. And I got inside because the family gave me access to all our papers.
So what kind of access did you have with Sandra Day O'Connor? I mean, did she keep journals, diaries, and who did you speak to? And she's still alive, right?
She is alive.
She has dementia.
She has dementia, but she's alive. She was pretty lively when 3 years ago, the first night I went with her, she worked a room of 150 people and was with Justice Souter, whom she addressed as Toots.
I don't see him as Toots,
no,
but okay.
Not me. They held hands and she called him Toots. What can I say?
I don't see her as Sandy either, right? But
Sandy, yeah. Or as John Riggins called her, Sandy baby. I had access to her papers. Now, not all of her legal papers. I had access to her court internal documents up to 1991. Once there was a sitting justice, in this case Clarence Thomas, then that ended. So I didn't see all of her memos. I saw the first 10 years, but not after that. But very significantly, I had access to her clerks. Clerks are the keepers of the flame.
Yes.
Every year, a justice has 4 clerks. They know everything, and they are sworn to secrecy. And I had a letter from her saying, please talk to me. And so I interviewed, OC and I interviewed 94 clerks. There were a few who did not speak to it with us. And, of course, they varied. You know, some were incredibly open and others were guarded and strange.
Because they still felt like they beholden
they have an oath to the institution as well as to the
Yes.
justice. So it's a little complicated that way. I appreciated they did not condescend to me. These are the smartest law students in the world.
Yeah.
And they could have looked down their nose at me, a B-plus student from UVA a long time ago, but they didn't. They were very helpful. And that was because you can't read those documents unless you have a Sherpa taking you through the mountain passes. And the clerks were the Sherpas.
So how do you avoid the sort of traditional trappings of a soup to nuts biography that she was born on, X day, and then the case by case by case aspect of her working life?
Well, the good news is she was born on a ranch, and that ranch was pretty exciting and pretty interesting. I mean, this giant ranch. I mean, how many kids are growing up shooting a rifle before they're 10 and driving a truck and, going to the roundup and galloping on a pony with their hair flying? So I had a lot to work with. And it wasn't just window dressing. This shaped her self-reliance, her relationship with her mother and father. These were incredibly important to her jurisprudence. So I had the blessing. And this is a real issue for biographers because often the first 40 years of their lives are not that meaningful. This was meaningful. And it set a stage and also was just fun writing.
Were you the first person to write that William Rehnquist proposed to her?
This is our scoop because of this access. This is actually an interesting story. Her papers are at the Library of Congress, and we had access. And OC and I are wondering, where are the love letters? Because there are a lot of correspondence, but no love letters. I was looking for love letters between John, her husband, and her. So we were over in her chambers where we did a lot of work, and her secretary took us into a storage room downstairs, and sure enough, there's a box called correspondence. We said, what's that? The love letters between John and Sandra, but also we discovered 14 love letters from Bill Rehnquist, who was a law student in Sandra's class at Stanford Law School in 1952. And in one of those letters, Bill Rehnquist says, Sandy, will you marry me? That they had not ever told anybody. They had not told their own families about that. I don't think I would have been allowed to see that box if they had. It was a kind of a mistake.
And tell the story of when Rehnquist went to dinner to meet her father.
Well, Rehnquist flunked the parents' test. Her father gave him a fried cow's testicle. I think they call it a prairie oyster or a mountain oyster. I don't think Rehnquist appreciated that. The family legend told to me by her brother, Alan, was that Rehnquist had, quote, disappointed Mrs. Day with his bad table manners. This is a long time ago. Who knows what really happened down at that ranch?
She went to Stanford, graduated near the top of her class, came out of there with 4 marriage proposals, but no job offers.
Right.
And this is a story that, of course, we are more familiar hearing with regard to the second female Supreme Court Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Right.
No one really talks about that with Sandra Day O'Connor.
They don't. I mean, Sandra Day O'Connor is 12 years before Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I mean, if it was hard for Justice Ginsburg, imagine what it was like. How hard was it? They didn't do class rank at Stanford, but she's in the top 3 students, roughly. Rehnquist was probably number 1. Not a single law firm in the West Coast would even give her an interview as a lawyer. She got one interview to be a legal secretary, and her typing wasn't good enough. I mean, it was just absurd. Now, the good news is she was a terribly self-confident person, and she didn't want whine about that or complain about it.
Well, there was no whining right on the ranch.
No whining, exactly. No whining. She said, I was grateful because it made me go to the public sector. She went over to the DA's office, and he said, I can't hire you. I don't have any jobs or money. And she said, I'll work for free. He said, I don't have any space for you. He said, she said, I'll work off of your secretary's desk. That's the way she was. And it led her into the public sector, and she did pretty well in the public sector.
And she went into politics, rose to become the leader of the Arizona
Senate. She's first ever woman to be the majority leader of a state Senate anywhere ever. That was an extremely taxing experience. The Arizona legislature in 1970 had a lot of guys who drank too much and did not treat women well. She put up with that. She had a certain look on her face that said, don't mess with me. I only found one actual case of sexual harassment, which I dealt with in a footnote. But it's a very crude place, and there were a lot of drunks. And my favorite story is this guy named Tom Goodwin, who was a drunk by 10 a.m. drunk, a real drunk. And he was that House Appropriations chairman. She had to deal with him all the time. So finally she called him on his drinking. And he said, if you were a man, I'd punch you in the nose. And she answered, if you were a man, you could. She was tough.
But she did not consider herself for most of her life a feminist.
No, she was, one of her clerks said she was an unfeminist feminist. She was a transitional figure. She knew that. She knew it was going to work better for her if she was not threatening. She wore skirts, not pantsuits, little things like that. But the stylistic things that actually made a difference in her day when she was coming on board. She was good at men in a non-sexual way. She was a flirt, not a sexual flirt, but a flirt. She got on with men well. She could be matey and sporty. And she was never an activist like Ruth Ginsburg. Mm-hmm. That was not her deal. But behind the scenes, she did plenty for women's rights. The best example is that she introduced the ERA in the legislature and then let it die in committee. Why? And she was infuriated. All the feminists were, you've sold us out. And the reason she let it die was she knew it wouldn't pass. Phyllis Schlafly was in town, and just wasn't going to pass. So she was a realist and a pragmatist. And instead of butting her head and getting all hot about the ERA, she went around as a legislator and changed every single law in the state of Arizona that discriminated against women. She went local and didn't fight the losing fight for the ERA.
So you've described her several times as a pragmatist. How ideological was she?
She was nominally a Goldwater Republican, and, she was a Republican. She was involved in the party, but she was really a moderate. She was a compromiser. She was the swing vote. She hated that word swing vote. She thought that made her sound fickle, but she was the decisive vote, as she would say, in 330 cases in 25 years. That's a lot of power.
Did she have a firm judicial philosophy?
No. And she was criticized for that. The professoriate does not love her. It's sort of hard to identify what her judicial philosophy was. She's broadly in the tradition of pragmatism, Oliver Wendell Holmes. I can spin up a kind of phony theory about this, but in fact, she was a case-by-case, very factually oriented, intensely focused on what the practical consequences would be. I once tried to engage her in conversation about judicial doctrine. She said, those kooky ideas, and we kind of waved them off. Now, she was making a joke, but she's just not a doctrinaire jurisprude.
One of the things that Supreme Court watchers kind of obsess over is the question of whether a justice evolves as they are on the court for a number of years. Did she change?
A little bit. She went from right to left. Yes, she did. You can track it. There are various measurements of this.
Does she think that she did? Does she say that?
Grudgingly. Maybe through clenched teeth, maybe a little bit. Where you can see it is in, unsurprisingly, cases that involve women and children. Yes, she did. She comes on the court as more of a Rehnquist-like, let's get the federal government to dial back a little bit on telling the states what to do. But as she's a justice, on issues like sexual harassment, which are federal statutes, she upholds them and doesn't look after the state's interest. She's looking after the interest of the woman or the child.
Did she like being on the Supreme Court?
Oh, she loved it. Yeah, she really loved it. I had access to her wonderfully, thankfully, her husband's diary. 20 years every night.
Wow. And how open was he in his diary?
She doesn't tell him everything. She's discreet even with him, so I can't pretend that it's, but every once in a while he would say, hey, tell me, and she would. I remember him writing about once how she felt like she was in the catbird seat at the end of the year because she liked those close votes where she had the power. She sometimes she said, oh, it's hard, and what am I going to do? But she said that other times she enjoyed it. Surprise, she liked power.
Did she worry about her successor?
She didn't like her successor,
Alito.
She's a discreet person who doesn't complain about anything, but she did complain about Alito. She was disappointed in him.
Why?
Well, for one thing, he is doctrinaire, and he's doctrinaire to the right, and she worried that he would undermine her legacy on two big issues, especially affirmative action. She was the one who preserved affirmative action narrowly, but she preserved it, and abortion rights. Again, she preserved abortion rights narrowly. She narrowed them, but she preserved them. And she was worried that Alito and the other conservatives were going to get rid of those things.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that she was discreet because I want to hear what she thought of her fellow justices on the court.
Well, she wasn't totally discreet.
So what did she have to say?
She was frustrated with Harry Blackmun, the guy who wrote Roe v. Wade, who was very suspicious of her. She was always trying to win him over, and she once blurted out, I even went to his damn prayer breakfast, and she just could not win him over. That was frustrating. She loved Justice Powell, who was gentlemanly and courtly and took care of her. She was suspicious of Justice Brennan, who was a great operator and a manipulator. She respected him, but she didn't trust him. She loved Rehnquist, the guy who asked her to marry. She loved him in a quietly intimate way. They were real friends. The person that Justice O'Connor had the most trouble with was Scalia. Scalia was rude to her, publicly rude. He once wrote one of her abortion decisions, it can't be taken seriously. Come on.
I mean, that's interesting because he got along famously with Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yes, he was jovial and hearty and went to the opera and liked Italian food, but he was sneering, intellectually contemptuous of Justice O'Connor for being too much of a moderate and too much of a pragmatist. And they clashed. O'Connor was very careful not to let him get her goat, never in public. Her clerks would write in nasty stuff about Scalia, and she would take it out. So she was always never going to pick a public fight with him, but they really did clash. Given
her stance on affirmative action in particular, what did she think of Clarence Thomas?
Well, that was a very affecting story. He told me this, that when he came on the court, told me, I felt hammered by the Anita Hill hearings. She obviously hated those hearings herself, but she walks with Thomas back to his chambers after the first conference and says, those hearings did a lot of damage. And he doesn't know what to say. He thinks that he doesn't know how to answer that.
Because he doesn't know what she's referring
to. Right. Is it me? Is he thinking, is he talking about me or the institution? She doesn't say anything more. But then the next day and the next day and the next day, she walks with him and she says, Clarence, you got to come to lunch. Clarence, you got to come to lunch. She made it her business to make the other justices come to lunch. When she first came to the court, only half the court even went to lunch. She would show up in their chambers until they went to lunch. Same thing with Thomas. She said to him, Clarence, you've got to come to lunch. And finally said, yes, ma'am. And he said it changed everything for him. He joined the group. He told me she was the glue. This is her. I'm sure she totally disapproved of the whole Anita Hill thing. It made her clerk said it made her very uncomfortable. But,
just because it was so sordid and because it brought down the sort of dishonored the institution and the process.
Yes. But they're stuck there together. They're there for life. They have to work together. And that's her view. You don't have to like your colleagues, but you have to work with them.
She liked some of them, though.
Oh, I think she liked Clarence Thomas. But she had to work at it, and she was a realist. She didn't expect to like everybody. She tried to like them, but she didn't. She knew that human beings are not always likable.
Bring us back to her own appointment, obviously not as controversial as the appointment of Clarence Thomas. But, for those of us who don't recall when Reagan nominated her, how big a deal was this to her, to the public? What was the reception at the time?
To the public, it was enormous. The cover of Time magazine was Justice at Last. I mean, it was the first ever fully televised congressional hearing. This was, the law was a closed shop for men in 1980. And there weren't that many women in public life in 1980. We've become accustomed to it because of Hillary and Madeleine Albright, all sorts of pretty I wouldn't say the battle's totally won, but it's
No.
it's not. But it's a lot different than it was in 1980
Yes.
when there was just nothing going. And it was a huge breakthrough, and she was not prepared for it. She didn't, she was a state court intermediate court of appeals. Her least favorite course in law school was con law. She didn't know any con law.
But she was a confident person, right?
Yes.
I mean, did she?
Yes. But although I have her diary, she had an off and on diary, and she said on the very first argument, she knows the press is waiting for her to ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
She finally starts to speak, and the idiot lawyer in front of her talks over her. And she writes in her diary that night, "I felt put down." This is a very uncharacteristic comment from her. She's not the kind of person who felt put down, and she didn't feel put down for long. She was scared, She was not afraid to cry. When she was the majority leader in Arizona, her aide told me once she found her in the bathroom crying after a tough battle on the floor. So she's human, She's not made of steel, but she was pretty tough and dealt with it and just moved on. She was not somebody to look back. It was just, deal with the situation and move on.
Her memoir, her best-selling memoir, Lazy Bee, how truthful was she? How clearly did she recollect her own childhood? Because I imagine as you go back and look at it, perhaps you're finding out a fuller picture, maybe a slightly different story.
There were some facts that were changed. Yes, there were. For instance, there's a scene where her father throws a lariat over her head and drags her out of a pool. And in her telling, she doesn't mind it that much, and they're just about to go into town. Actually, she was being sent back to school to be apart from her parents for 8 months. It was a much more traumatic event that she led on. Mostly it's straight, but in your book review, Linda Greenhouse, a long time, wrote that it's a palimpsest, very interesting word, meaning you can see the real words underneath a layer of new words. You have to sort of look underneath the words to see, and you can only faintly see them, the real words of her life. The book, I noticed that the structure of the book is completely random. I think that's because she did not want a through-written version of her life. She wanted to talk about the Cowboys and the Roundup and the this and the that, but not really about Sandra. She comes through, but obliquely.
I think palimpsest is probably one of the best memoir names for that Gore Vidal chose for his own memoir. Right. You call her the most powerful Supreme Court justice of her time. How does she earn that?
Well, by preserving affirmative action and abortion rights for 25 years, bingo, she qualifies just for that reason. She is the decisive vote. They started calling it the O'Connor Court. She was more powerful than the Chief Justice than her old friend Bill Rehnquist.
Let's end on just one fun fact about Sandra Day O'Connor. My favorite was the fact that she had cooked every recipe in the Julia Child's Mastering the Art of French Cooking. What was the most interesting or offbeat, fun thing you learned about O'Connor?
This is somebody whose entire life was booked every second. She's majority leader of the state Senate, and she's cooking every single recipe. And Julia Child and one of her friends, "Oh, Sandra, do you really have to do everything perfectly?"
I don't know if she did everything perfectly, but clearly she did many things well. Evan, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Pamela.
The book again is called First Sandra Day O'Connor, An Intimate Portrait of the First Woman Supreme Court Justice by Evan Thomas. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Joining us now, Mitchell Jackson. His new book is called Survival Math, Notes on an All-American Family. Mitch, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with the title and the subtitle you chose. They're very deliberate. Survival Math. People might not know what that means.
Yeah. So I have been trying to re-clarify for myself what that means. I mean, it came out of a particular incident in my life when I was in my 20s, and a guy confronted me with a gun, said he was going to kill me, and the kind of calculations that I made between his threat and my response to that threat. And then years later, I started to think about like all the kind of decisions that I was making in what seemed like a few seconds. And I ended up calling it survival math. So I think it's like the kind of calculus that one needs to exact, when they're faced with like an immediate existential threat.
All right, I want to go talk about that incident in more detail because it's a really powerful story. So how did you get on that street with that guy and that gun?
Yeah, so in my 20s, I was a college student, but also selling drugs.
This was in Portland. You were at Portland State University?
Yeah, I was at Portland State University. I'm a Portland, Oregon native. I think because I never really committed fully to being a drug dealer, and people knew that about me, like they knew I was in school, I was like an easy kind of target for a robbery or some kind of other nefarious acts. And so some guys tried to kick in my back door one kind of, I guess, spring day. And luckily my neighbors threatened to call the police and they ran off. But then I went to go talk to kind of like my mentor back then, and he told me who it was. And so I didn't put out any kind of alert that I was looking for this guy, but one morning I was coming out of a house really early in the morning, and I saw a guy on a bicycle kind of riding towards me, and it was like summertime, and he had on all black with a skull cap, and this is like pre-hipster Portland, so I didn't really know who he was. And then the closer he got to me, I'm like, oh man, that's the guy that they said tried to kick in my back door. And it's strange because he flipped it. He was like, I heard you was looking for me. And I was like, what? And then he pulled a pistol out, and I'm like, oh, wow.
I mean, what did you think when he said, I heard you were looking for me? I mean, what?
I immediately started to think about all that I'd heard about him. Like, we were former high school classmates. We had several friends in common, guys that I grew up with since, kindergarten. And I knew that he was a gang member, like all these kind of things. And I already had heard that he had killed someone. And so I was like, I need to be really careful about how I respond, because I also looked around and saw there were no witnesses.
So how'd you make that calculation?
That's it. That kind of information, like, you look down the street one way, no one. You look down the street, no one's, to the left side or the right side. What are the chances that he will actually shoot me? I've heard that he will do this. If he shoots me, is he going to try to kill me? Like, is he going to shoot me in my leg or my stomach or my side? Like, can I survive that? All these kind of things are going on in my mind. And then ultimately I just say, no, I'm not looking for you. And that was enough to diffuse that situation for the moment. But what really made me kind of reckon with this idea of survival math was like a month or two later, he actually did kill someone.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that must have been incredibly stressful.
Yeah.
Did you make any decisions after that based on that quick calculation?
Yeah, I think I was doing it all along. I was just in LA on book tour, and I went to go hang out with some people that I know from Portland, and they took me to this like small club. It wasn't even a club, it was like a lounge, but they were playing hip hop. And when I got in there, I'm like, well, I know that LA is kind of notorious for, certain areas of LA are notorious for gang violence. And it was like, I was looking around the room for the guy who looked like he wanted to do something to someone. And I saw him. And it's just like, it's a look that is so familiar to me. And I said to myself, like, watch him for a little while and like, don't engage with this guy, because you could just tell that like he was angry. I'm 43 years old now on book tour, and I'm still affecting survival math.
And the point you make too, I think, with the title and the aftermath of that particular incident is that this is a calculation that all of the men in your family.
Yeah. So in the author note, I quote the statistic of the Africans who survived the march to the ships and then the transatlantic passage to America, and it's 40% of them died. And so I think that's really symbolic that the people of African descent who made it here are really survivors in a very literal sense, right? These are people who were physically, mentally strong. Not to say that people who died or, jumped the ship were not, but I really think that since we have been here, we have been forced into some form of survival.
What you do with this book, I think, is so interesting because there is that big backdrop, that huge history.
Yeah.
And then there's your personal story.
Yeah.
You don't go with either one or the other. You take this in another direction. Your subtitle is Notes on an All-American Family. So when you're thinking about this, how did you approach the book?
A lot of people have been calling this a memoir. I always intended it as an essay collection, and I try to distinguish between the two. I think that a memoir is like a more sustained narrative or like a kind of slice of someone's life. And I think that the essays are all grounded in an idea. So I always imagine each of these as separate ideas that I was exploring, though they're connected because they all come out of some kind of experience that either I had or my family members have. And so it was really important to me. It is really important to me in all of my work to kind of situate it in historical and cultural and social context.
Mm-hmm.
I was just at this place called Fortune Society. I was telling a story, and then a guy was like, oh, I told the story about stitches, and the guy said, oh, that reminds me of what happened to me. Like, I got shot 6 times.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, wow. And then he started telling the story. He grew up in Brooklyn. He said once he got shot that he had to lay on the ground for 3 hours before an ambulance would come. And then the other guy said, I got that beat. He was like, I got shot in the neck. And then my girlfriend that was with me got stabbed 7 times. And we were in the mall and no one would help us. So I had to carry her body around to the front of the mall to get help. And then, so once I wanted to let them, tell those stories. But then I said, I think we can keep one-upping each other on trauma. But I think the questions to ask ourselves is, what made it possible for one, the gun to get in your community, for you to even have to live in that community, for police presence to be what it was, for the ambulance not to come. And I said, and if we're investigating that, like, where would we start? Would we start with current kind of police tactics? Would we go back to the civil rights movement? Would we go back to Reconstruction? Would we end up at the 20-odd slaves that landed in Virginia? So I'm like, I don't want to be just kind of, well, it's just a story.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be able to like historicize this.
Right. This isn't just one particular person who you can kind of say, well, it's all circumstantial for that person.
Yeah.
And what you do is you then go through the stories of all of the men in your life and then ground them in that history.
Yeah.
People who don't have this book in front of them, I suggest you look in a bookstore, look it up online, because the cover is also very powerful. And you were involved in that, right?
Yeah.
So explain what's on the cover and why did you decide that?
So all of the men on the cover are men in my family, all of my brothers, my grandfather, uncles, cousins, a nephew. And it really came out of like the inception of the Black Lives Matter movement and more how the media was portraying some of the victims as looking dangerous. So, I mean, I guess we could kind of really focus in on Trayvon and the hoodie.
Mm-hmm.
And I really wanted to speak to that. My intention was to decontextualize the men in the photos. So I shot them all the same way. I lit them all the same way. I had them take off, earrings and necklaces. I had them all wear the same thing. They're all wearing a black T-shirt. And I really wanted to say, if I take all of these things away, these kind of contextual clues away, what is it that you see in these black men? And then so I asked each of them the same question, which is, what's the toughest thing you survived? And then I wrote their responses in second-person narratives. But the caveat is I never mention which story belongs to which person. So again, I want to invite the reader to read the story, look at the images, and then try to connect them, and then furthermore to ask, what are my kind of biases? What is it that I'm seeing that is connecting this story to this particular person?
Did you learn new things about your own family members?
Yes. Oh, yes. So many new things. Well, first of all, I met an uncle right before I did the interview that I didn't know I had my whole life. Our family just discovered him like a month or two before I did the interview, and then I was calling my aunt and telling her about my project. She was like, oh, you should interview your uncle, such and such. And I was like, who? She said, oh, yeah, we just discovered he was your grandma's youngest son. He had been given up for adoption.
Oh, wow.
And grew up around the corner from my grandmother. And was actually really good friends with my uncle that I did know. And so, yeah, just to I'm like, hi, uncle, nice to meet you.
Mm-hmm.
We sat and talked for 10 minutes, and I'm like, okay, what's the toughest thing you ever survived? Yes.
What was the toughest thing he ever
Well,
said?
he was at the end of a 17-year sentence for rape. And when he went to parole, like the day he was going to parole, the way that he describes the story is like his daughter and I think maybe his nephew are outside waiting for him.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes to parole, and then officers come in there, as soon as he signs his paperwork, they're like, oh, I got some bad news for you. Like, there's a warrant for your arrest. And so he was remanded into custody on what's called a civil commitment charge. And what it is if the courts don't think that you're ready to be kind of released into society, then they can hold you indefinitely, and then they basically retry you. And so some of the men who are on civil commitment charges like never get out. And so he was facing that as a charge, and eventually, obviously, he was released. But I just didn't even know. Like, it seems like some kind of violation of your civil rights that you would be sentenced for a crime, do all of your time for that crime, and then they could just come and get you and say, no, we don't think you're ready. I mean, I guess you could take that a little further and say, like, if we are pretending that prisons are places of rehabilitation, then if you can't get a person to be able to re-enter the society after 17 years in your facility, then maybe we should kind of look at what we call rehabilitation as well.
Mm-hmm. So you're getting at, obviously, many larger issues with this book. How different was it for you to go from writing fictional stories to writing these very real stories?
Yeah.
Not only are they true, but they are close to you.
Yeah. Well, I think it kind of prepped me. Writing the novel prepped me for this. One, my novel was autobiographical, so I kind of had to work through the emotional kind of uncertainty about how much should I reveal and how was I revealing it, and also the kind of response that my family members would have when I was writing about them. Was really most concerned with my mother, who fortunately, I guess, gave me the kind of go-ahead, like, you know, if this is going to help someone, then I'll share as much as I can with you. One of the things that I tell my students is that if you are a fiction writer who cares about the sentence, that you probably have the most tools as a writer, because you know about narrative, like you can create scene, you know dialogue when you hear it, you understand structure. And if you care about sentence making, which I really do, then I think you kind of have the whole toolkit. Like, I think you could be a poet and be a lyric poet and like just not understand how a story is put together.
You've mentioned your mother and not so much your father. There's a line in your book. I want to read a little bit from it and then have you talk about it.
Okay.
I had a father because I made one, or rather I composed a father from the men at hand, brothers who kept me long before Obama made it a project.
Yeah.
Who was this composite father, and who was your biological father?
So my biological father, I don't remember meeting him until I was 10 years old. And in the interim, my mother had a long-term partner who's actually my two younger brothers' father, and he took me in and treated me as his biological son. He's passed. I still consider him my dad. But the composite was my grandfather, uncle, a former high school coach. And these were just men who I recognized had some quality that I wanted to emulate. And I think I realized pretty early on that there wasn't going to be one person who had all of the things that I needed. And so I needed to figure out how I was going to obtain what I needed. And luckily, they each had something very distinctive about them that I was able to recognize and then model.
So now I want to go back to that scene we started with, the gun on the street. How did you get from there to here? When did you become a writer?
In prison. So it's interesting because I remember going to jail and then reading about that guy killing the person. And I was like, oh, if he comes to jail, I'm going to whoop his fill in the blank, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't get sent to the same prison that I was in.
Was your feeling relief or disappointment?
No, I was like disappointed. Yeah. I was really waiting, and I was like, yeah, so we ain't no guns in here, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But then I started writing when I was about to parole, maybe 6 months earlier, because I knew that I was going back to Portland State University, and I wanted to prepare myself in the best way I could to be a student again. And so,
was there any barrier to that? Like, at Portland State, I'm back. Here I am.
I was on an academic scholarship,
mm-hmm.
and I told them that I had a family emergency, and they didn't ask many more questions beyond that. And so luckily, they held my scholarship for me. So I paroled in July 7th of 1998, and by September, I was back in school again.
We've talked a lot about men.
Yeah.
But this book is also really about women.
Yes. I woke up this morning thinking about how much I really wanted to lift up women in this book. A lot of these stories center on my mother. She was my top research assistant.
Mm-hmm.
I went back several times to her to ask her, to kind of reflect on a memory. And I really also think she had to have the most courage of anyone that was a part of this book. But I also talk about my great-grandmother, my maternal great-grandmother, who was the matriarch of our family and like really kind of sustained us through all these kind of tribulations while over the decades. There's also my aunt who ended up becoming a sex worker and was murdered, but then had a really profound effect on me when I was very young. And then, it ends with a letter to my daughter who I hope never has to face the kind of trials of my mother and my aunt and my great-grandmother.
You also, with regard to women, do something very interesting in this book. Now we're getting back to the
Yes.
technical aspects of the book. So
Mhm.
you weave in photographs, poetry.
Mhm.
As you said, it's not a straight narrative. It's sort of interlocking essays. And then something really interesting, victim statements.
Yes.
What are those?
So the essay is called The Scale. It was by far the toughest thing that I wrote. Just to give you a sense of it, in its initial stage, it was like 11 pages.
Mm-hmm.
When it finished as a typewritten page, it must have been like 60, 70 pages. I read an essay in Esquire magazine in 2011. It was an anonymous husband talking about his infidelities or his reasons for cheating and his rules. I mean, I had some of those same kind of pathologies, but I also was very critical of it. One, because he wrote it anonymously, and two, more so because he never stopped to reckon with the fallout of his behavior. And at that point, I said, I want to challenge myself to really, really kind of investigate or critique my behaviors and really what kind of harm I've done to my previous partners. So that really kind of sent me on a quest. But at that point, it was more just me. And then I went back to revise the essay. It was the last essay that I revised for the book. And because I had already kind of historicized every other essay, I knew then that I also had to do the same thing for The Scale. And so then I started to kind of investigate, like, well, what is this kind of history of patriarchy and misogyny, and how far do I need to go back to really kind of situate this? So I ended up researching Alcibiades and Lord Byron, but not to deflect, more to understand like where this came from. And, one of the things I think that made it really tough here was seeing all of my wrongs kind of out on paper. But the other thing was I got into some late stage revision and knew that it was all my voice. And that's when I was like, oh, I need to let the women in this. And so I asked 5 former partners to just share openly about our relationship. A few of them declined, but 2 of them were really forthright about, the kind of harms and even the fallout. And I think that really kind of turned it so it wasn't just this kind of male perspective. I think that was really essential to what the essay became.
I mean, that must have been painful
Oh, man.
to read.
Yeah. Painful to hear first.
Yeah.
Because I sat across from them while they were telling me these things. And I got to take notes. The other thing is, like, I also don't want to aggravate a wound.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like always questioning myself, why am I doing this? Like, am I going to do more good than harm with this?
To them.
To them, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that someone reads it and kind of recognizes either their pathologies or their experience. I hope that it leaves someone feeling hopeful, because if not, then it was an exercise in almost futility.
I also imagine that it must have been helpful as a writer. You're writing about other people's lives, intimate things,
Mm-hmm.
personal things, than to have that kind of be happening to you at the same time, having people write your story too, and then having to...
Yeah, and then not being able to edit.
Yes.
Oh, my God. Because even the writer in me was like, oh, she could have said that this way, but I'm like, but this is how she said it. I have to present it in this way.
Are you eager with your next book to get away from your own story?
Yes.
Back to fiction?
Well, I'm not eager to necessarily get away from being grounded in something that's close to me. So I already know what my next novel is. It's about a cult leader from Oregon. He's not from Oregon. He's actually from California, but he had his cult in Oregon. And I know people that were a part of the cult. It's also obviously in Oregon. And so to me, I want to stick with Oregon. Like, I want to be I really love Edward P. Jones and what he does for, the DMV. I want to be like the Edward P. Jones of Oregon. But yes, I do think that I don't know if I've exhausted like my and my family's kind of personal experience, but I don't think that I'll ever focus on it in the way that I have done in these last 2 books.
All right. Well, look forward to hearing about the next book from you. I'm
you.
sure our listeners will too. Mitch, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
The new book is called Survival Math: Notes on an All-American Family by Mitchell Jackson. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, this week it's Trump books.
Once again, it's Trump books. So Henry Holt announced this week that the new subject of Bill O'Reilly's book will actually be Donald Trump. He's writing a biography of the president. And this is somewhat of a break from him. As you know, his popular Killing series usually looks at long dead presidents. And those books have often been bestsellers. I think there's something like 17 million copies in print. But he's taking a detour and dipping into what seems to be still the one of the most popular subjects with readers, writers, and publishers, which is Trump. And so, this had broken earlier. I think Page 6 had the first announcement that Bill O'Reilly was going to be writing a biography of the president. He gave them an interview and said he'd recently been on Air Force One with the president, interviewing him on a flight down to Palm Beach. And in the press release, Holt is claiming that this book is not going to be partisan, that it's not pro-Trump or anti-Trump, that it's going to be, quote, a well-rounded view of the man and his sphere of influence. So Holt, of course, published Michael Wolff's huge expose on Donald Trump, Fire and Fury, which sold, I think, more than 2 million copies at this point. So it's been interesting to see publishers trying to span the political spectrum a little bit and play to both partisan sensibilities, because while there's an enormous appetite for exposés about the president and investigations and things like that, there is certainly an appetite for books that support the president. So we saw recently a book called The Case for Trump by Victor Davis Hanson got pretty high on our bestseller list. I think it's number 2. You're definitely seeing publishers experimenting with all kinds of perspectives.
Right. Whetting appetites across this political spectrum.
Exactly. This book is coming out in the fall, and I asked Holt what the first printing will be. They don't have those figures yet because they're waiting on pre-orders. But if his past performance is any indication, it will probably be pretty popular. And it won't be, of course, the only Trump book coming out this fall. There's a ton of other books. It looks like it's still going to be the number one subject that publishers and writers are looking at.
All right. I'm anticipating future conversations about this. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles, John Williams, and special guest star Carolyn Ryan. Carolyn is an assistant masthead editor here at The Times, former Washington bureau chief, former politics editor, resident baseball fan, and all-around super reader. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hello.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, let's start with you, John. What are you up to?
So last weekend, I finished a short but incredibly powerful novel called Waiting for the Barbarians by the Nobel Prize winner J.M. Coetzee. And I've read a couple of his books before, really admired them, but this is on another level. I think that this is an actual masterpiece, and I don't say that. That's a silly word, and I don't say it lightly. But just structurally, in terms of the writing, in terms of the insight into the human condition, it's about a magistrate who works for an unnamed empire, sort of at the edges of the empire, and he has been there a long time, and now the empire is making noises about what they call the barbarians, who they fear are going to invade and overthrow them. Of course, what they really are is just helpless indigenous people, and the empire is obviously in the wrong. And on one level, the book it's not even an allegory, it's just a literal story of anti-imperialism. But I think the reason it's so incredible, in addition to the fact that people aren't named, the empire isn't named, so it's very universal, is that though it is obviously anti-imperial, it is very complicated about what happens to both the quote-unquote barbarians and the people in the empire that kind of deforms everyone involved in the situation, and the ways in which cultures can and can't overlap and make peace with each other. And I found it very moving. It's very brutal in a couple of scenes. There are 2 scenes in particular that I won't even describe because they're so disturbing, and I think I'll never really shake them about the way that they bring these barbarians to their knees in a couple of moments that I don't think I'll ever forget. And I read so much that I tend to forget things. I don't have a great memory for the specifics of books, but I think I'll hold on to those.
For Coetzee novices or the uninitiated, what would you start on?
Well, the other two books that I've read are a book called Disgrace, which a lot of people talk about as if it's their favorite, and it's very good. I might start there. And I read a book called Foe,
That's,
F-O-E,
yeah.
which is a bit more idiosyncratic. I read it because I had just read a book about Robinson Crusoe and sort of the history of it and how it's taught in British schools. Really interesting little book. And it mentioned it. And so I went and read it, and it's Robinson Crusoe told from the perspective of a woman who washes up onto the island and meets them. And it's brilliant. It's really good. And maybe the last quarter of it fell apart a little bit for me, but I would recommend that one too.
That's the only one that I have read, which it was actually assigned to me in college as part of a course on the origins of the novel. So in addition to reading Robinson Crusoe, we then read Foe. Have you read Katsaya?
All I've read is Disgrace, and I really liked it a lot, and it stuck with me in ways that a lot of books don't in terms of specific images and themes, but I have not delved further into his catalog.
Disgrace is a devastating, devastating book and stayed with me forever. And the movie, actually, which I think stars John Malkovich, is also fairly devastating. And I don't think I've read anything else by him, but that was one of the most profound reading experiences. I read it after I came back from South Africa, and it was just a searing novel.
Oh, I can't imagine reading it in those circumstances. Yeah, it must be even more searing. But he's terrific. And I would almost hesitate to say start with Waiting for the Barbarians because it sets a bar, I think, that even he probably doesn't always get up to.
All right, Carolyn, what are you reading?
So I'm reading the new biography of Frederick Douglass by David Blight. And I have to say, I am just enthralled. I think many of us grew up reading Douglass's books in school, and you have a sort of sense of a very impressive, towering American figure and intellect, but you have a very two-dimensional sense of who he was. And I got intrigued with his life. Many of us loved Transatlantic by Cole McCann, and you have kind of glimpses of Douglass as an adult and already a statesman. But what this book does, which is kind of magical, is it tells the story of kind of the nurturing and development of an intellect and just such an impressive mind. And the story takes him from the eastern shore of Maryland, where he was a slave, to a very prominent family in Maryland. And by happenstance and accident, he ends up being moved to Baltimore for a period. Obviously, in Baltimore, there were a lot of slaves, but there were also a fair number of free blacks, and there were immigrants, and he's mixing with all these young boys from different German immigrants, Irish immigrants, and he starts to love reading. And you just have the sense of like how hungry he was for knowledge and what a remarkable mind he had, even as a boy. And the part where I am now, he's kind of hiding as his reading becomes kind of a troublesome point for the slave owners. And it's just such a powerful testament to what learning can do. The writing is at points novelistic, and it's really transporting. And you get a sense of the brutality of slavery and also the everyday indignities of slavery, but also the complexity of these relationships. And it feels like a towering book for a towering figure, and I'm just loving it.
It's interesting because despite the vast differences in circumstance between Alexander Hamilton, the obvious one being race and also time, there were these parallels in their stories that I found kind of interesting, in that these are two people who came from really tough circumstances. In Douglas's case, obviously, even tougher than Hamilton's because he was enslaved, but that they make their way through this determination and this intellectual curiosity and really like make a name for themselves at a very young age through their writing and through speaking.
That's exactly right. And it feels extraordinary. And in Frederick Douglass's case, there's kind of a loneliness about his experience because learning starts to excite him and exhilarate him, but it also separates him in a lot of ways from the other slaves when he goes back to the eastern shore of Maryland. But you also have, as you say, like an interesting confidence that he's going to do something special and a faith in that from a very young age. And it's sort of impressive given, how his life, which we know how it works out, but there's this kind of momentum about his life and his learning and his teaching at an extraordinary, like an adolescent age that just feels to me really remarkable and kind of singular.
The other thing, I don't know if you're in that section yet in Baltimore, but when Blight came on the podcast, he talked about how at that time, it wasn't like a plantation where there were very separate quarters for enslaved people and for, the owners and the free workers. But in Baltimore, it was all mixed, right? It's like
that was really a revelation to me. I mean, just the way that Douglas, as a young boy, is exposed to free blacks, to, as I said, immigrant children. And some of the interesting conversations are, he befriends these boys in the neighborhood, and they kind of say to him, this is so unfair. This is so unfair. And there's, again, like kind of an opening of his eyes. And, you really have a sense that Baltimore was just this spark that, like, the world opened up to him and started to change his views. He gets to know an older man who is sort of a person of faith, and they talk about scripture together. And again, it has this sort of profound, not only impact on him, but kind of motivation for him as a young person.
All right, I feel like this is a very natural segue to your book, Greg.
Yeah, I am doing something that I don't do a lot, which is rereading a book, although in this case, it is almost as if I'm reading it for the first time. The novel is If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin. I first read this book when I was probably about 14 years old. And in some ways, it has the feel of a young adult or middle grade novel. It's very much a coming-of-age story. I've wanted to revisit it since the movie came out a few months ago, and there was a lot of renewed attention to this story. And so I finally pulled it off my shelf and started rereading it, and I found that I remembered nothing at all about this book. Even because it's called If Beale Street Could Talk, I mistakenly thought that it was set in Memphis, not New York, but it's very much a New York novel. For those who have not seen the movie or read the book or followed kind of the conversation around it in the last few months, it is very much a story of Black family life and a romance, a love story between the main character, who is Tish, a 19-year-old woman, and her fiancé, Fonnie, who is serving jail time for a rape that he did not commit. He's been set up by a dirty cop who had it in for him. In some ways, that setup of the story overlaps a little bit with Tayari Jones's An American Marriage, where, again, an innocent man is sent to prison for rape right after he's married. And it looks at the justice system and the pressures on Black family life as it intersects with a racist justice system. In this case, the love story is really the heart of it, and we learn right from the beginning that she's pregnant with his baby. And so there's a real pressure on them to try to free him from prison. And the families are coming together to do that. The families don't like each other very much. So there's a lot of kind of conflict and tension between them. It skips around in time a lot. It's not a straightforward narrative. So we get the story of his arrest and imprisonment and their relationship all kind of piecemeal, and they've known each other since they were little kids, since she was like 6 years old, and they grew up as kind of tight friends and gradually evolved into a romance. And we get his family, and it's very religious, but kind of throughout, it's always in her voice, and so in a first-person narrative, which means it's not the way that I think of Baldwin, which is this great kind of oratorical,
oracular, to use another O word.
Yeah. It's much more kind of personal and private and intimate than that. There are little flights where you see him bringing in kind of bigger social things. It's a very short novel. It's only about 200 pages, but it's one of these that kind of blows up like an atom. It contains all of this stuff, but he's doing it in Tish's voice throughout. And so it's not like his essays or his nonfiction making an argument, except kind of under the surface.
Have you seen the movie?
I have not seen the movie yet, no.
All right, John, you're withholding commentary, and we can tell.
No. I read the novel for the first time in preparation to talk to Barry Jenkins, the director, about the movie on a special edition of the podcast we had. And I found the book uneven and not really, I felt like it started out very strongly. The first page really gripped me. I remember the first paragraph really well. And then I think both the moving around in time and also the voice wasn't especially consistent for me, and I just felt like it didn't have the,
there
the
are
power
these
of his
dips
nonfiction.
into kind of that oracular voice.
I got the feeling that it was a great writer whose best work is not, in my opinion, in fiction.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that you like the first paragraph because the first sentence kind of put me off. I expected not to like it. And that first sentence, I've got the book right in front of me, is I look at myself in the mirror. And that just seems like such a writerly device.
Okay, the first sentence isn't that amazing, but I think if you went further, but we have another towering American life waiting for us. I feel like the three of you are really in sync here.
Well, Greg and I, it wasn't official, the competition between Ulysses and Master of the Senate.
It was unofficial, and yet you won.
And yet I won. So I finished, I'm sure to listeners' relief, I finished Master of the Senate by Robert Caro this week. And the last big chunk is about the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957. And it's really a blow-by-blow account, a lot of detail. And even though he was in the Senate for an additional 3 years, those last years are really treated like a coda to the main event of this book, which is really the transformation of Lyndon Johnson from this Southern Texas, he wasn't a member of the Southern Caucus officially, but he was certainly of that school and part of the segregationist senatorial bloc, to the person who shepherded the Civil Rights Act, the first Civil Rights Act to pass through Congress and be signed into law. And it's worth reading the book just for that section. And a few interesting things about it. One is it really does give you a sense of how the Senate works at the very micro level. So if in the beginning he's giving you a history of the Senate and sort of talking about these two macro level things that dominate the sort of functioning of the Senate, one, seniority, and two, the filibuster. With the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957, he's going into the really granular detail of how something gets through. And it's depressing, sort of what it requires to generate real change, especially, compared with maybe some more functional systems. But particularly because it is so difficult and requires so much, when you finally get there, it feels like the ending of a great novel. And I'm almost loath to give away the ending, which we all know. And yet it's told really beautifully. One of the points he makes is that, Lyndon Johnson at that point was not a great orator, to bring back the O word, and wasn't particularly sort of florid in his speech or moving. And when he did speak after the passage of the bill, what he said was pretty momentous. So I'm just going to read part of it. He said, that his vote, quote, will be treated cynically in some quarters, and it will be misunderstood in others. But the Senate has dealt fairly and justly with this measure. This is legislation which I believe will be good for every state of the Union. And so far as I'm concerned, Texas has been part of the Union since Appomattox. And it was interesting that last line was so important, because this was kind of the way that finally, although we know there was a lot that followed that was not great, but really finally began to bring the South back into the Union. And so it was very symbolic that he said that line. And then Bob Caro, too, is not overly florid in his writing style. And the story is so good that he doesn't need to exaggerate or embellish in any way. And yet he ends this section of the book, part 5 of the book, with this line: the great Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965 had all started there in 1957. That's right. That's right. Just like so simple and yet really great. So now I'm I wanted to come in here and talk about something new, but I'm at a rare moment where I'm actually at the deciding point, and I'm about to go on a small trip. So I have 2 books in front of me, which I'll probably talk about next week. One of them is part of a trilogy, a young adult trilogy that my daughter is pretty obsessed with. And I read a subsequent pair of novels by this author, Leigh Bardugo. This book is called Shadow and Bone. It's part of the Shadow and Bone trilogy, and it's really high fantasy. And when I was the children's books editor, I had assigned this book, which was her first novel, for review. She's currently working, I think, on her first adult novel for Random House. But this book takes place in this universe that she created called the Grishaverse, which is based on it's Russian in its sort of texture, and it's really good. She's a really great world builder. So I've only just started it. And then because I really cannot, I confess I'm going to Paris sort of just go with this YA novel. I'm also bringing thematically and also to bring us back to Emmanuel Carrere, who has not been on the podcast for some time. I have a pair of two of his early novels, Class Trip and The Mustache. Has anyone here read these?
I have not even heard of this.
I have that at home, of course, but I haven't read it.
You haven't read it yet. So I will report back, and then hopefully I might end up proselytizing. It might be the next wave of Emmanuel Carrere. So we will end on that note. But before we do, Greg, you talked about
James Baldwin, If Beale Street Could Talk.
And Carolyn?
David Blight, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom.
And John?
Waiting for the Barbarians by J.M. Cutsea.
And I talked about Robert Caro's Master of the Senate, Lee Bardugo's Shadow and Bone, and Emmanuel Carrere's Class Trip and The Mustache. Thanks, guys.
Happy
Thank
travels.
you.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague, John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.